Good morning, everyone. Alon here from Panda. We're here at Pressure Point, and today we're here with John Brodie from Mac Consulting to talk about all things data. Data and people metrics are not necessarily two things that go together all the time, but they should. And we're here to talk about how you can use data to drive a happier, healthier, and more productive organization. So with that, good morning, John.
Good morning, Alon. Nice to be here.
Yeah, I really appreciate you making the time. So, John, we were chatting earlier, and I think something that sticks out for me is that you are a clinical psychologist, which, people are ultimately what make an organization, and happy people are what make an organization. But I think you've got a journey that is interesting and would be valuable to share. So if you can give us a bit of background, that would be a great place to kick us off.
Yeah, sure. I started my career and I really wanted to work with people. And I was really curious about how people thought, how they grew, how they learned, and found myself following the path of becoming a clinical psychologist, which isn't an easy thing to do. You don't just happen to become one. You have to follow quite a deliberate process of studying and choosing and getting experience. And I did that for 9 years. And then after a while, I realized that actually for me, the impact I was making sort of sitting one-on-one in my practice wasn't necessarily the space I wanted to be in. I was really fascinated by how people thought and worked in organizations, and how we could potentially, if you worked with one individual, you could have an impact on many individuals. And so from there, I sort of moved into consulting, and initially moved into a practice that was very focused on training, learning, and development. But quickly recognized that too sort of was a very limited or narrow focus. And so sort of expanded my work into becoming more of an organizational development consultant, which really looked at leadership, culture, strategy, organizational capabilities, change. And for me, that sort of took me into the work around business transformation. And sort of as the world's evolved and things have changed, and we found ourselves very much in the future of work, or which we now to refer to at Mac, the evolution of work, is we're seeing that the business and the world of business is fundamentally transforming. And one of those big drivers, if you think about it, is the digital transformation. That's changing the work people do, how they do their work, where they do their work. And for me, quite critically, it starts talking to how people can be far more productive if they can, one, leverage the right sort of platforms, and two, and very importantly, can leverage data to kind of drive their productivity and the outcomes that they can deliver for an organization.
Cool. So that clinical background makes so much sense. Ultimately, people make an organization. I think what's unique about the work that you do in the consulting space is that you work with a variety of businesses across industry, across country. But ultimately, what I'd love to understand is what makes a good culture, because ultimately I think culture is, the old saying, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So is there anything that stands out for you around what makes a good culture?
I think there isn't a specific definition of a good culture, but there are certainly some principles that you can apply. I think just firstly, before I jump into that, I think for me, the key privilege I've had as a consultant and the work that I've been able to do is I've been able to gain a very intimate view into organizations, into what drives their thinking, the mindsets, how they perceive value, and how that then ultimately impacts the way they behave or deliver on their strategies, on their business models. And so I think for me, that privileged view has also really satisfied my curiosities, which is potentially why I got into clinical psychology in the first place. Was I was really curious about the human condition, what made people tick, how they thought, and how that influenced their behavior. And so when you go into an organization, I think key is that you start understanding what is really, really valuable and what drives the business outcome. Now, when we look at cultures, I think the first principle is that cultures are not what you write on the walls, that sort of set of values. Cultures ultimately are very tied to the business model and how organizations think about how they create value. And key is, as you start evolving your business model, as many organizations are doing now, as they move into a digital economy, they're having to reset their cultures, the way they do things, the way they work, to deliver a different set of outcomes, a different level of value. And that's quite key in terms of when we think about a culture at glance is that what's really going to drive business value. So everything you do is important to link it to that economic principle. The second component for me is healthy cultures kind of focus on value that is sustainable. So first and foremost, is the way we do things going to deliver a sustainable outcome? So it's not we're going to make a lot of profit this year, but we're going to take all the money from our customers and they're never going to want to buy from us again, right? You've got to think about what's really going to deliver a long-term sustainable value. That's the first consideration in a healthy culture. The second is when you look at sustainable value, you've got to consider a landscape of multiple stakeholders. So I can't just drive sustainable value for shareholders without considering the people that work in the organization. So what if I need a healthy people, healthy organization, healthy delivery for shareholders. Similarly, organizations these days don't just see themselves as operating in an isolated island. They're operating in communities which have expectations, right? Or societies that have expectations. So we've seen, for example, in banking, that when the banks sort of broke the trust just before the global financial crisis, people sort of, hang on a second, we're putting our money there, is that going to be sustainable? Suddenly society reacted with heavy regulations, lots of backlash against that, right? And so you really need to think about, play a role in societies and what's the sustainable value and outcomes that we deliver or shared value that we create for the communities and societies in which we operate. And then the fourth and very important set of stakeholders for most businesses are their customers, right? In terms of, are we delivering a service that is valuable? Is it delivered in a way that is fair and enjoyable? So that whole consideration around culture is quite important. So one is, does it create long-term sustainable value? And does it do that for that sort of shared set of stakeholders is key for what a healthy culture is.
A simpler answer is, how do you break that down? I mean, if, a leader of an organization is listening to this and they want to get that right, what are maybe some practical first steps that they can take, knowing that it is this holistic view that they need to have in mind when they're building the culture, because it's not just about employees, it's about that broader ecosystem. So what are those practical steps that they can take to get things right?
Well, I think what you're seeing more and more as a trend, right, is that because that's a complex ecosystem that they're working in, they're having to get better at having different data sources to really understand what the experience or the expectations of those different stakeholders are. And you have to continually balance that. So I think one of the first and probably the key steps that you're seeing as a massive trend is there's increasing amounts of attempts to get data, to create insights, and not sort of retrospective or lag insights, but actually starting to look at lead indicators around what is the expectation from a community. So you're seeing, for example, in a lot of the community work, there's a big focus on sensing, where you look at multiple data points, social media, et cetera, to try and understand what's going on in a certain community. Might there be some unrest? What's the expectation? Those are kind of some of the practical things that are starting to happen in terms of really thinking ahead and trying to predict and anticipate and therefore manage those expectations. The other is with people, right? You're seeing in the space of wellness, or is that if you look at absenteeism, that's a lag indicator. But how does a leader really understand what could I do differently to create an experience, to create a workplace that would encourage people to be engaged, to be productive? So those are some of the kind of big shifts and practical shifts that people are making in terms of rethinking how they manage their cultures and manage those expectations.
Obviously at Panda we love data. At Mac you love data just as much. How do leaders start building people-focused data, culture-focused data, thinking about it holistically across those pillars that you mentioned into their day-to-day? How do they track something which is sometimes a little bit less tangible than your revenue, right? How do you track these data sources? How do you get these data sources?
So I think a lot of what's happening at the moment is there's a big focus on implementing platforms. And there's a massive wave of people platform implementation, different providers putting those people platforms in. I think where most organizations are finding themselves, though, is they're not really geared to taking that data, integrating it, and then using it to make decisions. A lot of that data is often looking in the rearview mirror, or there are big question marks about the integrity of that data. So we haven't yet matured in terms of the way we manage that data to start using it in a way that is meaningful in predicting. And also the data sources aren't always that reliable or considered to be that reliable, and therefore people kind of don't always credit what they're seeing. So there's still a lot of default to, I'll use my intuition, I'll use my judgment, rather than let's try and see what the data is telling us, and how does that inform some of the decisions, and what other data sources could we build in, and how could we evolve our data models to really give us a much more integrated, holistic, and hopefully move us into a space where we can predict and then prescribe how we do things. So that's a big shift in the evolution of work, is people starting to learn how to work with that and integrate that data into their day-to-day to make them more effective, and actually more able to predict and be proactive in the way that we do their work.
Yeah, so I love that, moving away from the reactive to the proactive. So what are some of the ways that you are advising your clients to do that? Obviously, easier said than done. We all want to, not be like, hopefully from a physical activity perspective, that's quite tangible. I think people are thinking about healthier lifestyles. And obviously there are impacts on mental health from a healthier lifestyle. But how are you advising your clients from a people perspective to move away from the reactive towards a proactive?
I think what we're starting to see, where there's a lot of pull from our clients in terms of the work and the thinking that they want us to do with them, is to think about how do they build a more inclusive data model that actually looks at multiple data points rather than relying on sort of single data points to make decisions. So I think that's quite key. And if you see some of the spaces where that's advancing quite quickly, particularly in the social impact space, less actually in the people space in my experience, there's more in the social impact space, you're starting to see that people are looking for very different sort of data sources like social media and starting to try and integrate that. So for me, a lot of the shift is perhaps moving away from your traditional sense of what data we use to make people decisions or to make business decisions, and starting to look at what other data points are potentially available to us.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, social media, and is that the true pulse versus, there's a whole debate around traditional media and that having a very particular lens or bias, whereas if you can get that real content from probably a variety of sources from a social media perspective, a strong argument in a very data-driven scientific way that is more representative of what's going on. So how do you also avoid bias? Because I think it is easy to, maybe look for data which conforms to what you're thinking. How do you ensure that you get those objective data sources?
So I think maybe to take a little step back, I think what we're starting to see and what approach where we're starting to really advise our clients is to say, I think needs to be a reset on what you think the kind of outcomes are that you drive. So, traditionally, if you take the people space, you look at things like retention, attrition, and then we would look at things in the wellness space, and you'd have sort of milestones around. We've got a provider to provide the sort of counselling, and you'd look at sort of how many people use the service. So those are often quite retrospective or lag indicators, right? They're not lead indicators. So for us, it's starting to say, if you want to drive a different employee experience as an outcome, we now not need to start thinking about what are going to be valuable data points to track that. Not only to track it, but also to define what's important for people. So we're seeing also a shift away from sort of a one-size-fits-all view to starting to get to a far more nuanced view around different people, different experiences, different segments, different requirements. And so that shift is kind of where we're starting to really not drive that thinking, but really work with our clients in terms of how they think about what the outcomes are that they drive.
So you've alluded to and you've touched on the evolution of work, and I love that, versus the future of work. And with the evolution of work, there's an evolution of the value prop for employees and the value prop for customers, or how customers choose the brands that they buy from and how employees choose the organizations that they work for. So how do you think about that evolving employee value prop?
So I think it's great that you bring the idea of customers into this as well, because I think that we have to think about our employees are now in very similar terms. Just as the world has shifted towards customer experience as a differentiator versus products and services, right? Products and services can easily be copied, but the experience, and particularly the problems you solve for your customers, is a fundamental driver of most organizations' value proposition, right? So it's not Netflix is about having your content in one place. It's convenient, it's accessible, it's when you need it. You can fly with it. That's really great. So it solves a problem and it gives you something that you need when you need it. And a platform enables that. So when we think about our employees, I think there's been quite a big shift away from this idea of the employee and their personal life being kind of separate. We've seen the shift towards a hybrid workplace, which means that we've got to know our colleagues in a very different way, right? We've got to meet their dogs, we've got to meet their families, and suddenly that we've collapsed that boundary between work and personal life. Now that changes for many employees their expectation of what work is and how they experience their work. And also it challenges managers and organizations to think about how do we engage our people in multiple modalities when somebody's sitting at home and working, when somebody's never comes into the office, they work fully remotely in some other part of the country, or when you've got a big chunk of your workforce actually on site, right? How do you manage this difference? And we go back to our original conversation around culture. It's really challenging many organizations to rethink their culture, because the sort of overarching wisdom around a culture was we have a particular business, we have a particular business model, and therefore we need a very uniform, standardized way of doing things. But now, with these different experiences, we're actually being challenged to think about, well, potentially we need to offer a different sort of cultural experience with some unifying kind of themes, but the actual cultural experience might be very different for different people. And so that's the first thing that we need to think about, is how do you really think about the different experiences and the different way people are interacting with your organization and working for your organization, and how that is managed and what that experience needs to look like. The second component of that is how do you manage that practically, right? Because we now are seeing, we've adopted many digital platforms very quickly as we went into COVID, and now we've come out and they're just part of the workplace. But what are the other platforms that we need to start engaging in and thinking about around how we stay connected to people all the time? So one of the benefits, if that's a benefit or sometimes there's a massive downside, is ostensibly we can actually be connected to our employees for an extended period of times, well beyond when they are at work physically, right? We have ability to monitor their productivity in a way that we never had the ability to monitor, in terms of how much time they're spending, what they're actually doing. You can actually see that and track that now, right? So these are big shifts. Obviously, there's all sorts of things around privacy and managing people, but the reality is we now have a sort of an always-on workplace. We've moved into an asynchronous space where people will work at night on documents, where you can review it at night. You can be working 24/7, if you're working on those platforms. And similarly, when we think about things like wellness, and the services you offer your employees, their expectation now has moved away from, I'm going to just access it when I'm in the office, or it's going to be physically present. Actually, I'm at home, and I still want to access my health benefit or my wellness service, right? And so we're seeing that's where, for example, your platform is kind of stepping into the space, because it's giving people that access 24/7. Right? You don't have to sit in the defined 8 to 5 work hours. You now access that anytime, just as the way you can work anytime and collaborate with colleagues at any time.
So there's a lot there I want to unpack. I think you've touched on, obviously, Panda, you're a clinical psychologist, mental health, critical element to performance in the workplace. Like, what are you seeing from a trend perspective where leadership or companies are really getting it right, investing proactively in company or employee mental health, because happy employees make more productive employees. So I'd love to just get your clinical view on that.
So interestingly, I think what's really been powerful about the last few years is that this concept of mental health has sort of become mainstream. And I think what people have recognized is, and hopefully, and I think that's the trend, is that mental health is something we all have, just like physical health. So really the question we have to ask ourselves is, what's your status, right? How are you doing? And we know that your state of mind has a significant impact on how you engage with information, how you engage with colleagues, how you approach your ability to focus on work. So that is becoming a far more mainstream conversation, and not is becoming a far more mainstream conversation, and not necessarily one that carries the stigma. As soon as you think, oh, I've got mental health issues, like we've got to keep it, the voices get hushed, and we go, I'm seeing a therapist, oh, that's really bad. I think there's a lot more engagement around how do we promote mental health, not because you're ill, but because it's something that's really important to your well-being. I think this has also challenged managers because they've been pulled into spaces, and a lot of the managers I worked with in COVID, they said, I'm spending half my day counseling people. I'm having to deal with issues that I never had to deal with. Our meeting check-ins now become these sort of personal sharing moments, right? So that collapse into work-life integration has meant that also people bring a lot more of their selves and their whole selves to work. So I think that is the big shift in terms of managers having to really adjust to, if we're going to engage with this, how do I engage with it? What are the tools I have? What are the resources I have? And not only for my people, but actually big space in our customer base is how do we equip our managers to deal with conversations and engage in supporting people in a way that they never thought they or never previously had to do.
I mean, it's not easy to do that. It sounds like, maybe just on a human level, it's just about listening, picking up on what you're saying. I mean, I always joke, I've overheard a conversation in the past and someone asks, how are you doing? And the person said, I'm terrible, I've been very sick. And the person said, oh, great, I'm so glad to hear, because people just don't listen.
Yeah.
So something which I'm picking up from you is like managers need to listen. But also, I mean, there are limitations. There are going to be some issues which are maybe outside of their realm of expertise. But what are some of the practical steps that you're seeing organizations take to equip managers with the skills that they need to handle those conversations or refer employees to the right care when they need them?
I think most organizations that I'm engaging with are lagging a bit in that. I think they are still adopting quite a traditional view in terms of how it should be managed, who they should partner with, how they should track it, how they report on it. It's a pressure point for many of them. Sorry to use your podcast name, but it is a pressure point. So there's this thing of mental health, but there's quite a concern about opening that up without necessarily having the ability to manage it. And I know that when I was being trained, it's quite a terrifying thing. I remember being a young trainee, and then you're working in the hospital, and you're dealing with something that's quite scary, and people's emotions, there's intensity, and it was quite a process to develop certain skills and the ability to kind of maintain a level of empathy while not being totally overwhelmed by those feelings. So there are skills there that need to be developed. So for me, I think a lot of people are still lagging, and there hasn't necessarily been the shift in that focus. Having said that, though, there are things that have been on the radar in terms of leadership development, management development for the last 15 years. Emotional intelligence is a big topic. Right, so developing our managers' emotional intelligence. But now, more than ever, we really need to invest in building that skill.
And that comes back to data as well, right? How do you check that your managers are in tune with what's happening?
Yeah, 100%. And I think that just brings into the other piece, right? What are the resources I offer people when they aren't necessarily directly located with me? How do I support them, right? What's my responsibility? Where does it begin and end? Because now I might be very aware that a person is drinking during the day because I have access to their home and I can sort of see that they're behaving differently. In the workplace, we could control that. How do we manage it now? What are the referral points? How do we track that? So it is putting we're in a new space of how we manage that, what our responsibilities are, what the boundaries are that we need to put in place, and what resources we create. I think the other point is, to your point is, how do you really, if you go just step back away from the sort of mental health issues and into more people productivity, how do you actually track, or predict where your workforce is and potentially do some sort of proactive things to support them to remain productive, to maintain their mental health, deal with their anxiety or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I mean, for us, and you've said the point before, but I just want to reiterate it because I think it's so important, is this shift away from the reactive to the proactive. And again, you've said it before, thinking about mental health in the way you do your physical health. I think we don't think about mental health as something that you should invest in, but you should. So what are some practical steps that both managers and employees can take to be more proactive in their mental health and not wait for that moment of distress? Obviously, therapy plays a part. I'm married to a clinical psychologist. My mom's a social worker. I'm bought into the industry, but there are limitations in one-on-one care, and I want people to move away from the reactive to the proactive. So what are some practical steps we can take?
So I think the first step is obviously education and developing skills, right? So you've got to give people skills to be able to have the conversation, engage and identify, because for me that's absolutely crucial. The second thing we fundamentally need to rethink is how we track health, mental health. So there's other things that we'd naturally want to track. If you work in a mine, people are going to send you for medicals. They're going to, because it's actually going to impact the job if you're not physically healthy. But if we start thinking about the fact that the mental health of our employees has and potentially can have an equally negative impact on their work productivity, on their colleagues, etc., how are we going to track that? How do we know that is in a good place, not a good place? And then, very importantly, once I've identified that, what are the kind of resources or spaces that I refer to people to support them? Because typically, mental health support is an expensive thing, right? And it's much easier to justify, well, I've broken my leg, let's send you and get you, and there's a sort of a fixed time frame around recovery. When you get into mental health, that becomes a little bit more nebulous, more difficult to track. So we're going to have to get better at that in terms of understanding what we can and can't offer, how we offer it, and looking at more optimum ways actually to drive wellness versus reactively look at health. Because for me, I think that's what we're seeing, and you're seeing that trend. It's not new, but I think many organizations have adopted the term wellness, but without necessarily internalizing the fundamental shift that it requires in terms of how you think about your role in supporting your employees.
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of key points there just around trackability, critical. It's touched on, I think, in all the points that we've spoken about, whether it's at an organizational level, I think people just out there not checking in with themselves, thinking about how am I doing from a mental health perspective? And those are practical steps that we can take. And also not waiting for that moment of distress, finding those outlets, to invest in your mental health, talk about how you're feeling with each other, at a human level, which again, I think is easy to lose track of because you're caught into the day-to-day, you're caught into the deliverables. I think a point that you also touched on earlier was just around incentivization, and what do we measure for successful managers is critically important, because if we're not measuring or incentivizing the right behavior, it's probably going to be overlooked. And then just creating that holistic view on wellness, away from physical wellness only, but mental wellness. I think something else which I'd maybe like to touch on in closing is, how do you find the right balance between driving a high performance culture? If I think about my role at Panda and providing a supportive environment, because sometimes those two things can conflict, where you want to drive the most from employees, you want to get the most out of them, but you also want to have a supportive culture and you want to create boundaries. And it's difficult to get that balance right. What are some practical steps or some organizations that are getting that balance right, where they're driving high performance, high productivity, high output, but employees remain engaged, they remain happy, and they're able to perform at that optimal level in the way that an athlete can?
I think critically, when we looked at a traditional workplace, right, the psychological boundaries were quite well defined and actually quite physical. You will be in the office at 8 in the morning. You will leave at 5. There are certain times when you will take breaks. You will disconnect, right? When we find ourselves in a hybrid, always on workplace, where you go home and there's emails and things coming at you, and on the weekends you can be interrupted, we now need to reset the psychological boundaries. And I think that for me is a fundamental piece of work around culture, which says, in our culture, what are the boundaries that will help us to create an environment that sustains high productivity in our employees. And that doesn't mean that everybody works until 24 hours, because that's not sustainable. So we are being challenged. And in many societies, if you look at Germany, for example, they've started to legislate where it's illegal to send people emails over the weekend. They block those sort of things. So we're having to reset those boundaries around true sustainable productivity. And I think that when I go back to my definition of a healthy culture focuses on sustainable performance, right? Not just in the short term, but for the long term. And linked to that, it's about what investments do you make in terms of being able to track and understand where the health is and how you potentially support. And support doesn't mean, we provide counseling. Support might mean that we invest in certain things that enable you to sustain your health, your mental health, and encourage you to do the right things, right? We know that there are many behaviors that are predictors of good mental health, right? Sleep, having the right sleep patterns, shutting off from work at certain points, spending time with family or close friends, because those are fundamental things that create good mental health. And if you don't have those spaces, encouraging people to develop a good social network and support network is a fundamental driver of mental health, right? So what are the things that we can do to help our employees to do those things and those practices that actually will encourage them to be good, healthy, productive individuals? I really go back to Freud's 2 principles of a successful life, right? He says, Lieben und Arbeiten, which really is the ability to love and work, your ability to form intimate, sustainable, and productive relationships, which for me extends beyond just your personal relationships. It extends into your work relationships, your colleagues, your family, your friends. And Arbeiten is the ability to work and work productively, right? And those are the 2 things that really drive a healthy individual.
Yeah, so I think it kind of ends where we began around sustainability and the critical need for that. And I think people to listen to their bodies as well. Like if you're feeling like you need to get an early night, do that, because there's clearly a signal there that you need to listen to. I know I said it's my last question, but because you're a clinical psychologist, the topic that keeps on coming up is, from the future evolution of work perspective, is resilience, right? And, I think if we think about a future skill set in an employee, the last thing I want to really pick your brain on is how do organizations think about resilience? Because something which, again, we always talk about in this world that we're living in is changing faster than it ever has before. The workplace is changing. It's a theme that's come up consistently in what you're saying here. So how do we prepare for this future of exponential change?
I think the Yuval Noah Harari is kind of one of his big challenges or predictions that we will face as human beings, is that the rate of change accelerates faster than we can learn, right? And so it's not that we can't learn and adapt, but actually that just to do that 3, 4, 5 times, 6 times in a year, it's just too much, right? I heard a statistic the other day that said that the half-life of a learned skill has dropped now from 20 in the last 20 years to 3 years. So that constant rate of learning, and why I really link that to resilience, is a resilient human being has that ability to adapt, right? That's what really is like a key measure of resilience. So something changes, something hits you, you have an unexpected event, you have a trauma, it forces you to reset and rethink your purpose, your focus, your skills, what's important, how you do things. It's a learning skill, right? And so for me, we have to create space for people to reset. We have to create space for people to reset. It's like if you don't reboot your computer, it's going to go into cognitive overload, like it just crashes, right? And that's where we're putting a lot of people into a space where we're not giving them the space to reboot, to relearn, to reset, to refocus. What's important? Where are we going? The why, the purpose, and how do I need to do things differently? Often when I coach executives, or I've coached executives after the last 20 years, and I've worked with a lot of them that have transitioned, and I've been very fortunate to work with a lot of them as they made multiple transitions in their careers, is my kind of key sort of wisdom or learning that came out of it was, what made you successful in your last role may not be the thing that makes you successful in this new role. And so that reset and relearn. So yeah, last thought, if we don't invest in creating space for people to reset and rethink and adapt, they will burn out. And learning isn't about more information. learning has to translate from three kind of key principles. Where am I going? So that talks to you about what do I want, what does success look like? Have you got clarity on that? Because as things change, you have to reset that direction. The second thing you have to look at is, where am I now? So what's working, what's not working, what's holding me back, what's limiting me? And then finally, what am I going to do differently? And then you've got to have the process for reinforcing you to do those things differently. I often say to people, I've run many learning programs, and I've said, people go away and they come back and they're still doing the same things. Yeah. They haven't learned anything. Yeah. They've got a lot of information. They might have even developed some skills. But if you don't translate that into doing something differently, then you haven't learned. And so my challenge often to also organizations and leaders, if you've implemented this change, what are you doing differently?
And I guess with that, it comes back to trackability, right? Yeah. And actually measuring what you're doing. So, John, that was fascinating. I really appreciate your time, appreciate your wisdom. Thanks for being with us today.
Cool, Alon. Thanks very much for inviting me. Good to be here.
Thanks, John. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. I think the big takeaway for me was data, data, data. You can't improve what you can't measure, whether that's at an organizational level or as an individual. Get the metrics, look at what's working, what can be improved, iterate and move from there. So thanks again, and we look forward to you joining us again. Thank you.